Great. So I'm gonna welcome everybody back. I hope your first breakout session was as um, interesting and like really engaging as mine. I really just had a great talk in Yuman's room about ENL learning. So I'm very excited to introduce our second EdTalk speaker. She's someone who I've known for years. She's like a very dear friend, and she's also I would say like her passion and genuine love for this profession really inspired me to be a teacher. So her biography I'll read to y'all. Alejandra graduated in 2021 from Duke University with her BA in public policy and her elementary education licensure, K through 6. She is a current first year TeachHouse Fellow, and she teaches 7th grade social studies at Brogden Middle. During her undergrad career, she worked at a local education nonprofit in Ahmedabad, India, as part of a DukeEngage service trip. She studied abroad in Copenhagen, Denmark. She taught English at a Danish school, and she worked for 3 years at a very wonderful local Durham nonprofit called StudentU. She's passionate about using culturally affirming pedagogy and an equity lens in her classroom, and she hopes that all her past, present, and future students feel empowered to become changemakers in their communities, just like she is. So I'm going to welcome her to give our second EdTalk.
Thank you, David, for that great introduction. Good evening, everyone. I first want to say thank you for being here. It means a lot to us at TeachHouse, but I think more importantly, it means a lot to everybody who's here. So thank you for being here. Let me share my screen and my sound. Do you see slides? Yes, amazing. Okay, beautiful. Well, as David said, my name is Alejandra Gómez. I'm a first-year teacher and a first-year TeachHouse Fellow. I teach 7th grade social studies at Brogden Middle School here in Durham Public Schools. So I will open with this picture, which I realize is slightly embarrassing, yet illustrative of my teacher persona. So last Saturday, Brogden hosted a community day for students and families to come together in celebration of all of the hard work that we've accomplished this past school year. As part of this special day, 15 of my students performed poems that they wrote titled Where I'm From. And their poems were the culmination of a mini unit that we did around identity, personal narratives, and the history of our communities. Tonight, I'd like to tell you a little bit about this work and how I think it fits into a larger conversation around shifting classroom dynamics as a result of the COVID pandemic, but also the importance of building a strong classroom and school community. So we all know that the pandemic has created an intense loss of connection in our communities, and that this has been especially challenging for children, for our students. So my #1 priority coming into this school year has been to address student needs and create a classroom community that can really be responsive to those needs. However, I want to acknowledge that teaching in a pandemic is all that I know. I did my student teaching virtually and transitioned to in-person teaching this school year. So for me, it feels really crucial to create space for dialogue between students. But I think that unfortunately, from what I'm seeing, the traditional school system often takes away students' ownership from their learning and strips children of their individuality. And yet, I think that the most valuable learning in a classroom actually comes from students' own experiences and questions and guidance. This feels even more necessary as we transition back to in-person and into this endemic, after an extended period of time in which human connection was really limited. I've been thinking a lot about the fact that we isolated in much smaller circles than those we normally inhabit in our extensive social networks. So for instance, my students have shared with me that they spent the pandemic almost 2 years exclusively in their homes with their immediate families and connected with a very small circle of friends virtually. So the transition back to in-person learning provided a much wider scope of what community looks and feels like. For context, my school and classroom community at Brogden is ethnically, racially, and linguistically very diverse. thus expanding the communities of which my students and myself are a part of. I think that learning from one another is priceless. And yet, as I said earlier, schools don't often position children as experts in the classroom or engage all facets of students' experiences and the learning process. In my experience, I've seen how doing so actually increases learning and makes it more relevant and meaningful to students. So the mini unit that I mentioned earlier revolved around this anchor text. It's a recently published children's book titled Born on the Water by Nicole Hannah-Jones and Renee Watson. The book is written in verse and is based off of the 1619 Project for those of you who are familiar with this work. The book is about the consequences of slavery and the history of Black resilience and resistance in the United States, and it's told from the perspective of a grandmother talking to her granddaughter. But before we dove into the book, we watched this music video. It's called Immigrants, We Get the Job Done. It's produced by Lin-Manuel Miranda. The video tells the stories of refugees and immigrants arriving to the United States, of their contributions that span centuries, and of the otherness that they still face today, living in a country that often sees immigrants as a collective rather than as individuals with their own stories and their own dreams. It was especially important that these conversations be accessible to all of my students. And as always, I encourage them to communicate in their native languages, in Arabic, in Dari, in Spanish, and of course in English. Students talked about their impressions of the music video. They swapped stories of how they emigrated to the US, crossing the Rio Grande, and they wondered about some of the deeper symbolism and lyrics in the song. I truly think it's a privilege to teach and work alongside students who literally come from all over the world, who are multilingual and who are multicultural, and who are really proud and excited to share that culture with our classroom and school community. I want my students to know where their peers' home countries are located on maps and what life in another part of the world is like. I want them to continue to ask the questions they've been asking this year. How long would the plane ride to Afghanistan take? And what's your favorite home-cooked meal? So after we examined the music video, we read the anchor text numerous times. And different groups of students had different preferences for what our reading looked like. Some preferred the recorded read aloud version that I made. Others wanted to do chorale reading. Others wanted to do popcorn reading. And I've really tried to give students flexibility and choice. And so I usually just go with what they want. While we read the anchor text, students individually in small groups and as a whole class recorded their reflections in a companion journal to guide our reading. And you can see some screenshots from the companion journal on my slides. The student journal that I created for students is based off of the teacher's guide that the authors of Born on the Water published, and it has really excellent resources. So to close out our book study, we read the poem Where I'm From by George Ella, and then reflected on where we are all from as it relates to our 5 senses. Again, it was really important that this activity be accessible to all students. So I used a lot of visual cues, which you can see up on the screen as well, and simple language so that we could all engage and feel comfortable. The final step for our mini unit was for students and myself to write our own rendition of the Where I'm From poem. So I wrote my poem and I performed it for all of my students, and then it was their turn to try it out. I did create a fillable template for English language learners and for exceptional children to use if they wanted, and a lot of them took advantage of it, but some were like, nope, we're good. And I'm really, really proud of their final poems. They were unfiltered and passionate, and for some really, really vulnerable. Here are some lines from some of the poems that I pulled together. And everything I've talked about brings us full circle back to Community Day. The students who wanted to perform were able to perform their poems at our celebration. And I don't say this just because they're my students, but they were truly shining up on stage. And actually this past Monday when we had class, one of our students who was most nervous about performing said, Ms. Gomez, I was thinking that we could do that poetry slam thing again. It was actually really fun. So without further ado, I will close out these reflections by sharing some of my students' performances. The first one is a little bit lower than the rest, so maybe turn up your computer volume and please enjoy. And that's all. Thank you so much. My students aren't here, but let's give them a round of applause because they will be watching the video. They're very eager to see it. Yeah, they were amazing. I linked the resources that I referenced in my presentation, and it's on the launch pad. And that's all I've got. Thank you so much for hearing me.